For your reference, I am recording this. All registrants will get a link to the recording tomorrow so that they can review again if there's stuff that you want to go back to do. We've had a great week of events. That began on Sunday, and today is our final day. So we look forward to this webinar and just to bring your attention to our final event, which is 3:30 this afternoon. It is a ribbon cutting and ADU tour and open house at 1949 Melrose Street. So the event begins at 3:30. I think the ribbon cutting is at 4 o'clock. And then it'll go, it's open until about 6:30 or so. So we invite you out there to the final event, the closeout event for Madison Housing Week. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Bill and Carol. And if you have questions, you'll just drop them in the Q&A button, and we'll take the questions at the end. And I'll also send reminders out in the chat through that throughout this webinar. So Bill, Carol, the floor is all yours.
Hey, thank you, Darren, and thank you for everybody who's participating. My name is Bill Connors. I'm the Executive Director of Smart Growth Greater Madison. Smart Growth Greater Madison started over 20 years ago, and our mission has been continuously to provide local government elected and appointed officials and staff with accurate information about the consequences, the real world impacts of proposed policies that have to do with real estate development and housing development, and certainly the conversation about how we can allow more housing construction to deal with our shortage of supply is something we care a lot about, and we try to be involved in those conversations in Madison and Sun Prairie and Fitchburg and Middleton and any of the suburban communities in Dane County and sometimes outside of Dane County. So that's who I am. That's who Smart Growth is, and I'll let Carol introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carol Schaefer. I am a full-time employee of JLA Architects, but in that role, I also do some consulting and advocacy work. So Smart Growth Greater Madison is a client of mine. I actually was the executive director in a previous time for about 11 years. So I've been immersed in the Dane County housing and zoning and commercial development world for about 20 years. Came out of state government, worked for the then general contractors, the developers, and now an architectural firm. So I've kind of seen this from a lot of different angles. So hopefully we'll bring some insight for you. And first of all, I guess I should say welcome, and I'm so glad that you've chosen to join us on this beautiful Friday. And as we walk through this today, we really want to give the perspective of what the real estate developers see on the ground in the Greater Madison and Dane County market. And it might sound like it as we get out of the gates that it's just a complaint session, but it's not. It's really an attempt to give you a clear-eyed look at why multifamily housing is so difficult and challenging to build, even when the demand is strong and the developers want to build. So our goal is to get everyone in the room kind of speaking the same language about these barriers so that we can work towards solution. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to address some of the things that are happening that are positive and that are moving forward and trying to address some of these issues.
Yeah, so as Carol mentioned, it is challenging to produce multifamily housing, and that runs from what's called missing middle housing, which oftentimes is just smaller scale multifamily housing, up to the larger apartment projects or condominium projects. So there are a variety of things that make that challenging, many of which are not in control of local governments, some of which are in control of local governments. And so we'll try to highlight some of those that actually local governments can do something about. Carol, you want to add anything? I think you covered quite a bit in your
Yeah, and just a little bit of context too, Dane County is one of the fastest growing counties in the Midwest, and the city of Madison alone has had significant population growth over the past decade, and that supply has simply not kept up, and it's not an accident. It's a result of the system with multiple different detection points and that add cost and time or uncertainty to the development. So there is not one single factor that's the villain. It's not just zoning or not just the costs, but we'll get into kind of the specifics on as we go through the slides, but just putting it, the scale of the challenge in Madison is worth kind of anchoring. The average rent for an 880 square foot apartment jumped from $1,162 a month to $1,530 a month over the past decade, and vacancy rates have stayed around 3%, which is below the 5% considered healthy. So just to put a little bit of that into to context, as our esteemed UW-Madison urban planning professor Kurt Paulson put it, the market is squeezed with more demand than supply, and as housing dies, it's by the death of a thousand cuts. It's never just one thing. So we're going to unpack some of those things today.
Yeah, and you may have heard that in Madison we actually have creeped up closer to like a getting close to a 5% healthy vacancy rate. That's as a result of the private sector recognizing that there was a tremendous need here and making investments and local governments working with developers to enable that to happen. So we are kind of like temporarily getting closer, but there's projections are that there's going to be continued population growth. So you can't, this is not a situation where you could just declare victory and then not do anything more, because we'll be behind, we'll be back to a 3% vacancy rate quicker than you can, blink, if we don't continue to have projects moving through the long pipeline. It takes years from conception to actually opening a building for leasing. And so it's something that we need to be vigilant about continuously. Can't just like I said, can't declare victory and ease off. So I'll go on to the next slide. So I mentioned there's a variety of things that are causing challenges for constructing new multifamily housing of all scales. And some of them, like I've said, are in control of the local governments and other ones are not. So rising construction costs, obviously local governments can't do anything about that, but that continues to be a really impactful factor, that when you get to a certain point where the buildings cost so much to produce that the rents people are willing to pay aren't high enough to cover all of that. And so in that point, investors stop investing. And you will see that particularly in other parts of the state. You get outside of Dane County where the wage structure, the compensation structure for employees is different, is less. People can't pay the rents that would be needed to be able to cover the cost of constructing new multifamily housing. So you don't see a lot of it unless the government is somehow providing some sort of incentives to make it happen. Another issue is outdated zoning codes and land use plans. Some of these land use plans haven't been updated in a very long time, and the market has changed dramatically. And so those can be impediments. Zoning codes will go into more detail about some of the challenges those create. Just anything that creates delay or uncertainty, that drives up costs and makes it harder to make these projects work financially. And if they look like they're not going to work financially, then investors don't invest, projects don't happen. We continue to see escalating fees, particularly impact fees. There's various different communities are imposing wide varieties of impact fees, and then the existing impact fees go up and up and up, particularly park fees in community after community, including Madison, keep going up and up and up, and that cost somehow has to be covered by the revenue generated by the new building. And the complexity now of what you have to put together, what a developer has to put together to finance one of these projects is daunting. I think people have an idea that developers all the equity money that's going into a project is coming from the developer, the one source. But very frequently, there are outside equity investors who are providing part of the equity. And then, of course, you've got a lender involved as well. and they have different sorts of needs that they need to be met, or they won't make the loan, they won't make the equity investment. So all of these things make it a challenging environment. Carol, you want to chime in with anything on that one?
No, I think we're going to get into a lot more detail on each of those points as we move forward. So,
All right.
as noted, here we are with the rising construction and labor costs, and as Bill was speaking to, as he's giving the summary, construction costs have risen dramatically over the past several years. I mean, we all know that we saw the major spikes during COVID of lumber, steel, concrete, supply chain considerations, and some of those have moderated, but they haven't returned to the pre-2020 levels. I can give a concrete, no pun intended, example. I was part of a project for the Salvation Army, and we were looking at a building in 2018 and 2019 and got pricing during that time, and it was, looking to be around a $30 million project. Obviously, the pandemic paused that effort, and when we came back to get that pricing in the last year, it was closer to $50 million. So it's not an insignificant jump in the cost of putting together a project, and so that has made us have to relook at what that project looks like, if where we're going to do it, how we're going to make it work, value engineering it. So that is, it is a real, it's not incremental, it's significant. Labor is another significant driver. As Bill mentioned, the skilled trades workforce in Wisconsin has not grown fast enough to keep up with the demand. So you've got wage pressure, it's real, and subcontractor availability affects scheduling. I've heard that certain subcontractors have been going to work being paid extremely lucratively on things like data centers, and so they can't get those subcontractors to work on the less lucrative housing projects, and so getting that labor is challenging. So that's something that in Dane County specifically has been a concern. And then land cost is something that people have to think about in infill contexts, where a lot of Madison's growth needs to happen given the urban growth boundaries. Land is expensive, and it often requires remediation or comes with infrastructure challenges that a greenfield site wouldn't have. So the construction type of, for example, a three-story wood frame apartment over a concrete podium is fundamentally different construction challenge than a single family home or a flat surface parking lot. Higher design standards, structural requirements, coordination between the trades. I had a developer that came in and wanted to do an infill project in Madison. And it worked with the zoning, it worked with a number of things, but the construction type they would have been required to do because of the infill site and the turn radius needed for fire trucks. Since they couldn't get a fire truck in there, they would be required to do another type of construction, which was exponentially more expensive, and that project just didn't pencil out. So when the construction costs go up, the required rent to service the debt goers goes with them. And when the required rents exceed what the market will bear, that project simply doesn't get built. So that is definitely one of the challenges. Bill, I don't know if you have anything else on that, or if you wanted to.
I'll chime in a little bit on the land costs. So, they aren't making more land. So it is what it is. We can't make more land, and so as it gets used up, the price of what remains that is developable continues to go up. But there's also local government impacts on that high land cost. It drives up the cost of land. Many local governments in their comprehensive plans try to lay out where they want, specifically where they want new development to take place. So they will say this pocket here, we want this to go first in 10 years, and then the next 10 years this part over here, and then 10 years later another part over here. And the problem is that the spot where they've identified they want the growth to happen in the first 10 years, there may be no landowners who are willing to sell their land during those 10 years. Developers can't force farmers to sell their land. And so if you get in a situation in community after community that the area that they've identified as the first priority growth area, there are no landowners selling land in there, then you essentially have no land available for development, and that causes or very little land available for the development, and that causes the little bit of land that's available for development to skyrocket in price. So it's important for local governments to look at that from a policy perspective and see if they've blocked out large enough areas of land for development, say in the next 10 years, so that there's a likelihood that there'll be some farmers who will still put their land up for sale during those 10 years. All right, I'll move on to the next one.
Fun with zoning. Um, Zoning is something I've been deeply embedded in for many years. I was actually on the City of Madison Zoning Code Rewrite Advisory Committee where back in 2012, where the city redid the zoning code for the first time since 1966. It was a pretty heavy lift. And I'll preface this before I get into some of the challenges by saying that it's it's really encouraging what the city of Madison is doing now to try and work on modifying their zoning to make it easier to create housing. So I will start with that they're really making efforts, and a lot of other surrounding communities across the state and in Dane County are doing housing studies, and they're updating their zoning codes, and they're really trying. But in the meantime, here's some of the challenges that still remain. So zoning is foundational. If the zoning doesn't allow you to build what you want to build, and you can't, full stop. There's, in much of Dane County, that zoning code wasn't written with what today's housing types or demographic needs are today. So that resulted in a heavy reliance on what we call planned development districts or planned unit developments, PDDs or PUDs, depending on which zoning code you're looking at. But that's a perfect example of that. They were originally meant to allow for flexibility for innovative projects, but in practice, it used to be very heavily Madison became the default vehicle for getting anything that didn't fit neatly into an existing zoning category done. So that meant that nearly every significant project necessitated negotiating and discretionary approval. So that can introduce uncertainty, time, and politics into what should have been more of an administrative sort of project. But Madison has been moving away from the PDDs, both with the zoning code update and now what they're doing in different zoning districts, which is a positive step. But some of the surrounding municipalities still rely heavily on them. And that can, again, the uncertainty is something that is difficult for developers because if you don't know what you're going to be required to do or what you're going to be able to accomplish with a project, it makes banks skittish, and so it can be problematic. Overlay districts are also something that can be a positive or a negative thing or add costs. Some overlay districts, like our transit-oriented development districts, allow for greater density, which can help. Others, though, can impose design or use restriction that constrain what's buildable and push up costs. The requirement for ground floor retail is a good example of a well-intentioned policy that can work against housing production. If the market doesn't support retail, which is true in some of the corridors now, requiring it on the ground floor can mean vacant commercial space or a project that doesn't pencil out at all. I live personally right off of Park Street, and there are a lot of vacant ground floor retail spaces up and down Park Street. And again, it's a great idea. You want to have an active pedestrian experience. You want to have those things, but if it's in an area where it's just not going to work, just requiring it can be problematic. Height limits and step back requirements directly affect unit count. So every time you lose to a required setback or lower height limit, it's a unit you can't spread those fixed costs across. And so that drives up the per unit cost of everything else. And as we were talking about a little earlier, one category of housing that this has been extremely challenging for is that quote unquote missing middle, buildings with more than one unit but fewer than 20, the duplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, smaller apartments, ADUs. So that type of housing Madison is trying to address with their updated zoning and allowing it, but that is also has been a challenging area. So creating that housing that it's not luxury, but it doesn't qualify for the affordable housing tax credits is very challenging. So the key zoning levers indicated in Madison's regional housing strategy, for example, they are talking about these kind of things and the best practices for a residential zoning guide. Um, Took planning directors from across the Dane County, and they've got a practical evaluation checklist and zoning districts specifically designed to re-enable missing middle housing across the region. So that's something that we're working in a positive way, but it continues to present a challenge in the meantime. Bill, I don't know if
Oh,
you want to add on to that.
yeah, yeah. I was just going to mention you talked about the uncertainty issue,
Yeah.
and so if a developer's got to spend $100,000, $200,000, upfront on engineering and architecture and things like that, just to get to the point where they get to find out whether have a project or not have a project, that's a tremendous risk that all that hundreds of thousands of dollars could be flushed down the toilet if the decision makers in the community say no, we're not going to approve that. So having a zoning code that says these are the things you need to do with this kind of project, and if you check all the boxes, the answer should be yes. And if you check all the boxes and you don't know whether the answer is going to be yes, that makes investors, developers, very reluctant to go forward in that community with that kind of environment. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that's unique to Madison in this area. Madison's the only one that has urban design standard, well, or an urban design commission, I should say. There are design standards in almost every community, but Madison takes that to another level with its urban design districts and its urban design commission. And over the years, the commission has existed for many years, and over the course of time, um, it has been able to expand its jurisdiction and scope of authority over time, without anybody really checking that. And so it has made projects again, from a timing perspective, how long does it take to get through the process, and what all your project's going to have to include, which can add considerable amount to the cost. You don't know until you showed up in front of the Urban Design Commission several times to find out what they're gonna do to your project. One of the challenges is developers and their team of architects try to they like to do an informational session with the Urban Design Commission to try to get a read on where their concerns are before they get too far into the design process. And so that's a great strategy in theory, but the problem is you get in front of the Urban Design Commission, and this commissioner likes lots of color, and this commissioner doesn't like color, and this commissioner likes this kind of style, and another commissioner wants a completely different kind of style, and it's really hard for the team of architects working with the developer to figure out how to satisfy all of those desires when they come forward with their first official presentation to the Urban Design Commission. And even then, once you now have really this first official presentation after the informational one, again, you start getting commissioners going every which way. Sometimes you get a situation where you produce a completely revised design based on their feedback, and they look at it and go, "Nah, gosh, I think I like the earlier version better." So that can be very frustrating. And then there are certain things that the Urban Design Commission, certain projects in certain locations, that the Urban Design Commission is the approving body. The Plan Commission might also be, the City Council might also be, the Landmarks Commission might also be. So you might have four different approving bodies, but oftentimes projects are going to the Urban Design Commission as an advisory body. It's supposed to provide advice to the Plan Commission or to the Common Council for a decision that they're making, that the Plan Commission is supposed to make, or the Common Council is supposed to make. But the Urban Design Commission will say, yeah, after you make your decision, Plan Commission or Urban Design Commission, Plan Commission or Common Council, we want the project to come back to the Urban Design Commission so we can work over the design some more. At that point, the Urban Design Commission isn't providing advice to anybody, but the ordinance says that we're supposed to be providing advice. So we get that's a source of concern and frustration. And then so the cost of adding features to these designs, and the cost of having to produce several iterations of designs to get through the Urban Design Commission, add costs to these projects that I mean, frankly, developers have to just go in with a great big contingency for what the cost is going to be added by the Urban Design Commission. Carol, do you have anything?
I'm just smiling because I've sat through so many Urban Design Commission meetings, and obviously I work for an architectural firm, so I am very, everything Bill's saying is a genuine concern. I just was going to share one story. I was with a client who was doing a minor alteration to an existing project, and it was adding a pool to their rooftop. And in the course of the conversation, we had a rendering. Mind you, this is a rendering; these are not real. And it showed red chase lounges around the pool. And one of the Urban Design Commission members said that the red chase lounges reminded them of red Solo cups and bad decisions. And the conversation delved into this whole conversation about then, oh my gosh, is the pool going to be safe, and so on and so forth. So we got through it, and at our next when we came back for our final approval, we made sure that the chase lounges in the rendering were white. So, but it just kind of, the arbitrary nature sometimes of the design review can be challenging. So, and I am glad, I think Bill, you mentioned it, that they are taking a look at that now and revisiting how that is structured, but it can be, again, creating more uncertainty, and it's not free to redraw those drawings. It's a risk.
Yeah. No, actually, I didn't mention that very much, Carol. So thank you for mentioning it. That yes, the city of Madison has a process going on to look at urban design regulation, about asking questions about what should be regulated, what aspects of design should be regulated, and what parts of the city should those regulations apply. So they're kind of stepping back and looking at this all with a fresh eye. And so we at Smart Growth are looking forward to participating in that process of a review of urban design regulation and where Madison should go going forward on that issue.
I'm sorry, one last point on that. I hear complaints sometimes from folks, even some people in urban design, where they'll say, oh, why do all these apartment buildings look the same? Why does everything look the same? And I'm like, well, part of it is what's required to be done in terms of setbacks, step backs. And others is that you get to know what the personal aesthetic preferences are of people on the land use decision-making bodies. And so you design accordingly, because you don't want to spend another $70,000 redesigning something when you know kind of what is likely to get approved. So that is a real thing. And they've acknowledged that and want to get away from that, because they want people to be able to do creative and interesting architecture. But if you know what's going to get approved, that's the route you're going to go. So just I've heard that complaint from folks before, so I wanted to give a quick addressing to that. So.
Yeah, and there's other people in the community who, no matter what the building looks like, if it's a big building, they don't like it. If it's a new building, they don't like it. They like things just to stay the way they are. And so sometimes I wonder about how much value the regulation of urban design has, because the people who complain about urban design are pretty much complaining about even the ones that go through the Urban Design Commission. So, but on to the next topic. So let's say you've gone all the way through, you've gotten 4 different approvals from the Landmarks Commission, the Urban Design Commission, the Plan Commission, and the Common Council. It's possible for a project to need approvals from all four of those bodies. Let's say you've got all those approvals. Well, those approvals almost always are subject to conditions. And so it's not unusual for when you've got all your approvals that there are like 100 conditions that need to be satisfied, and that different departments within the city government have to sign off that you have satisfied each one of those conditions. And that's a laborious process of providing information, providing updated design drawings to the various different departments, having them look at it. They ask questions, you send more information back, and you have to go through and try to get what we call a green check mark on every one of those 100 or more conditions on a city website. That can be very challenging, time consuming, unpredictable about how long that's going to take. And the predictability of timing is really important to projects. Developers want to start construction at a certain time so that the building is ready to be leased up like in the spring, summer. That's the best time to lease. If your project gets delayed by a number of months and you end up opening the building in November or December, now you've got very little leasing activity is going to take place during that winter time period. So now you've got a building sitting mostly empty for additional months, waiting for the prime leasing season to come around. So predictability of when the project, you can start your project, start construction is really important. It's also really important to the outside investors. They have a time window about when they're going to put money into a project, and they want to know your project is going to be ready for their money at a particular time. And if it's not going to be ready, if they don't know that they don't have confidence that your project is going to be ready for them to invest in at a particular time, they're less likely to want to invest in your project. And that's not a good thing. So, Carol, you want to talk about some of the you've dealt with.
Yeah, that request for
In your
information.
job, you've dealt with this issue many times.
I can't tell you how many times my phone call to a city staffer starts out with, "I'm sorry, this is the 14th time I've called you," but trying to bird dog where something's gotten hung up can be problematic. But that request for information cycle is definitely a delay driver. I mean, you get your approvals, you get your dispensation letter, you get your conditions. You're like, all right, let's get this started. But then you submit information, you wait for a review, you receive a comment letter, you respond to those comments, and you wait again. And each one of those cycles can take weeks. And on a project with, a construction loan ticking, or you've got other things, those weeks have a real cost. As I've been told, time is a deal killer. So the more time you add, the more cost you're adding to those projects. And then staff sometimes, and again, staff is doing their best, but they, with the funding at the city, they can't add as many staff as they need. So they're under a lot of stress and pressure as well. So they do the best they can, but adding conditions beyond what the ordinances actually require is a nuanced issue. Sometimes those conditions reflect a legitimate concern, but when they go beyond what the code says, and especially if they weren't flagged during the initial approval process, it can feel arbitrary and create delays when the project team is trying to understand and respond to those. And sometimes you run into conflicting conditions. It's a very frustrating scenario for everyone. So you say condition A from Plan Commission is incompatible with condition B from another reviewing body, and there's no clear authority or process to resolve that conflict. It can stall a project for weeks or months. And so that can be really frustrating and expensive. Also, there's what are called developer agreements, and that is a big wild card because those agreements, which govern things like infrastructure improvements, utility connections, public dedications, that's often negotiated, or that is negotiated after the approval process and approvals, and that can surface unexpected cost requirements that were part of the project's financial underwriting, and that can be a really big ticket item that they weren't budgeting for, and is a big problem. Again, at the city of Madison right now has been for the last year or so, year plus, has been looking at this what they call process after the process or post-approval process, a lot of process words, and trying to address it because the city has acknowledged that this is a problem and the planning department's actively been soliciting input from staff, designers, consultants, and developers to try and improve this sign off or get to green is what they call it. You can go on the website and check which departments have signed off with the little green check mark, and then all of a sudden you've got the red one. You're like, okay, why is it stuck there? How am I going to address this? And how do I get a hold of someone? And if you're a seasoned developer, well, that is your full-time job, it's navigable, but I mean, imagine trying to do that if you're somebody who's, a one-off developer or emerging developer, somebody that's trying to do a project that doesn't have a full-time staff or can't afford all of the consultants and lawyers and all of that. So I'm really glad that they're addressing it because it's something that we deal with all the time and it has real impacts. If you need to pull a permit to start construction and you miss your timeline, that can impact the whole time because the construction companies also have, their subcontractors lined up and their schedule lined up. So it's not something that's insignificant. You think once you get your approvals, you're okay, but the process after the process is something that we really need to streamline and look at and adds time and cost.
Yeah, piggybacking on what Carol just said, if you're a smaller developer, you haven't done a lot of this, those are the folks who tend to do like missing middle housing because the big seasoned developers tend to do much larger projects. They don't do those missing middle projects. So if you want missing middle housing, it's going to be smaller, probably less experienced developers. When you make a process that is really hard to navigate, those are the folks that get scared away. It's not a good idea for them to even try. And so so you get less missing middle built because of that. All right, so we'll move on here. Trying to check my notes. I'm going to be talking about this one. So I mentioned at the beginning about impact fees, particularly park fees escalating every year. That has to get paid for somehow out of the project, out of the revenue for the project. Sewer connection fees, again, keep going up and up and up. There's issues in some communities. We had this issue in Madison where there's an area that the city envisions that there's going to be a lot of redevelopment going to occur. But the sanitary sewer mains in those streets in that area are ancient. They're collapsing. They're undersized. They were designed to service, a few toilets in a factory instead of 100 toilets in an apartment building times, how many apartment buildings you're trying to put in that area. So, it would seem to make sense for a local government like Madison to say, hey, we're going to put this in a tax increment financing district. We'll use the tax revenue from the new projects that are coming online to pay for replacing that aged infrastructure and that multiple projects are going to benefit from. But for quite some time, the city of Madison's answer was, who's the first redevelopment project happening in that area? That particular developer, that particular project, you get to pay 100% of all that cost that needs to replace a mile of sanitary sewer main on that one project for the benefit of all these other projects that are coming later. That doesn't make any sense, but that was Madison's policy up until very recently. Madison has adjusted that now. They now are willing to spread this out by using tax increment financing to cover it. But that's a challenge about what local governments are willing to use tax increment financing for in situations where it's kind of like that's what TIF was created for. We have issues in many communities where you are going to develop a greenfield area and it's currently not able to be served by like an existing gravity sewer main. So you need to put in a big sewer interceptor, maybe a lift station. Again, you have this issue about, are you going to make the first developer in working in that area pay 100% of that? That doesn't work for the developer. That's not going to be feasible for them. How can you create a situation where you have a delayed fee that is paid in part by subsequent development, so that the city gets made whole on that investment at some point in time, but you don't try to make the first one in pay for 100% that's going to be used by many different subdivisions in the future. And when you get further and further outside of Madison, the rents that are achievable, what people are willing to pay in rents continues to step down. And so when you have all these additional costs, I mean, the cost to build a new apartment building is the same in any community in Wisconsin, pretty much. And so if the rents don't support it, as you get farther and farther outside of Madison, you get fewer and fewer projects that work financially.
Yeah, and this is pertaining to single family homes, but it's a similar kind of problem. But in 2021, the National Association of Home Builders published a study that found regulations imposed by all levels of government, including zoning, environmental fees, and building codes, add nearly $94,000 to the price of a new single family home. I don't have the exact breakout on how that goes per unit for multifamily, but I mean, you have the same challenges that adding all of that regulation. It's again that death by a thousand cuts. You add the bird-friendly glass, you add the stormwater, you add the tree placement fees, park fees, all the other regulation that goes into building a building. And when you look at what that percentage of the cost of gets passed along, obviously, in what the rent the market will bear, that is not an insignificant number.
Yeah, Carol, thanks for mentioning that. That number, that 92,000 number, it's a national average number. It's like 5 years old. And I've heard
Yeah,
that
exactly.
I've heard that the new number is coming out, and then instead of $92,000 per housing, new house, it's $120,000 per new house, entirely from government regulation. Now, we want to stress a lot of that government regulation is needed. So we're not saying you just eliminate all regulation. That would be a disaster. But we need to look when it's $120,000 added to the cost of every new house, and however much is added to the cost of each new apartment. We need to have local governments look at, maybe we need to dial that back some. All right, then we are on to, and we need to move this along, Carol. We
Yeah, we're gonna have
we would get done too soon, but we need to move this along. So there's the building code also adds costs. So there's requirements to have fire suppression sprinkler systems if a building contains 3 or more units, unless you do some other very significant things about creating fire barriers between attached units. That adds a tremendous amount of cost, actually. But we want to keep people safe, but it's a balance thing. It used to be that up to 10 units you could do without a sprinkler. Now it's only 2 units is the max without a sprinkler. Many countries around the world and other states in the United States don't require two exit ways out of say a small apartment building. Wisconsin requires 2 exit ways, 2 staircases to get out of every apartment building, no matter how small. So that adds a significant amount of cost, or another way of thinking about it, you can't put an apartment where that staircase is. And then Carol mentioned before, it's the kind of the layer upon layer upon layer of added costs, including in Madison and Middleton, bird-friendly glass, and there's the stormwater retention standards had to be increased because we're getting a lot more rain now than we used to 20 years ago. These costs mount up.
And also, I think we referenced here, so in July of 2025, there was a major ruling by the Wisconsin Supreme Court, the Evers versus Marklein, and that said that the legislative committees cannot indefinitely block administrative rules. So the impact of that was that now the Department of Safety and Professional Services could implement the updated commercial building codes based on the 2021 International Building Code standards, which had been stalled by the legislature since 2023. So that, again, it's not that code is not necessary or building code isn't, we're not advocating for getting rid of that, but that Supreme Court case all of a sudden changed all of the designs that you might have been in the works for. There was a small grace period, but that added a lot of cost to multifamily projects moving forward. So just that should be noted that Evers versus Marklean Supreme Court or Wisconsin Supreme Court case changed
All right.
the building code. Okay.
So Carol, we're gonna have to rip through these. We're running out of time if we're gonna leave time for questions. So we're gonna have to rip
All
through these
right.
last slides fairly quickly. So I think this one's yours.
Okay. Well, and I won't, again, in the interest of time, I won't get too deep into the weeds on this. I think we've already kind of expressed that the financing challenge is real. And we've talked about what they call the capital stack lasagna, as it were, where you're just trying to put all of these different things together to make a project viable. And that's where a lot of projects die quietly. They just, or the developers step back and decide to wait things out. You can clear every other hurdle and still not get built if the financing doesn't come together. So you've got combinations of the interest rates, which have been a challenge, the tightened underwriting standards that can compound that rate problem. Lenders are required to lower loan to value ratios and are requiring more equity or more conservative rent assumptions than they were a few years ago. So that can mean a developer needs more equity capital at a time when equity return expectations have also risen. The low income housing tax credits are a very important financing tool for affordable housing here in Wisconsin, but that allocation is limited and competition for the credits is intense. So a project that doesn't win a LIHTC allocation may not be viable. And the application process itself is a significant investment of time and professional fees. So the sophistication required to navigate all of these financing tools simultaneously itself is a barrier. So it concentrates development activity to more experienced firms and makes it harder again for these emerging developers or others to compete. So I'll keep that short and sweet, but financing challenges are another compounding issue in getting a project to work.
Carol, you want to mention some highlights of this one too?
So yeah, again, this I won't get too deep into the weeds on it, but a lot of the things that we've been talking about have been more municipality based and then some of the state things. But when you're trying to get your permitting done, there's oftentimes you'll run into bottlenecking because you need to go through jurisdictional environmental reviews. There's lengthy public hearing process. And we kind of already talked about the conditional use approvals with the onerous conditions. So trying to deal with permitting sequencing can be a structural problem. Many approvals can only be obtained in a sequence, so you can't go in for, this water and sewer before you go to this environmental if they've got, protection. So there's just, I see that we're short on time, but trying to sequence your permitting approval can be very challenging and add cost and uncertainty like many of the other things, or if you get appeal or litigation on things that also then stalls things out and it doesn't allow you to pull your permits, or your permits can be revoked if you get into litigation that they find maybe the plan commission acted inappropriately, for example, or some other problems. So that is just another consideration that adds a barrier to being able to produce this housing. So
Yeah, there was a missing middle project on Speedway, I think in
yep,
Madison, that where
yep.
it was approved by the Plan Commission and it was under construction, and then some local residents sued, and the circuit court said, yeah, the Madison Plan Commission messed up and didn't make the proper findings to be able to approve that. So that created a great deal of uncertainty about what was going to happen next. It all got worked out, and then the project got finished. But that kind of risk can really scare away, particularly smaller developers who do that kind of missing middle housing.
Yep.
So this is where we're gonna summarize, Carol.
Yeah, yeah, kind of key takeaways, and I hope that if we've kind of pulled the thread together on everything we've covered, I hope the central insight is how these barriers to creating multifamily housing interact, and every barrier that we've discussed has a cost, and some are in dollars, design fees, carrying costs, infrastructure, some are in time. Each month of delay in a construction loan costs money. and the regulations and outdated codes, post-approval, widen that economic feasibility. So as a whole, and again, as we said in the very beginning, hopefully we've laid out fairly clearly some of the specifics of these challenges and how it's not one barrier, it's not one thing. Um, it's a number of different things. And uh, hopefully that's what we've been able to communicate to you. We're happy to, if people want to follow up, we can share information and be happy to get into more of the weeds of it. But
Yeah, yeah. Carol and I have both mentioned that Madison has made strides on some of these issues and recognizes that it has more work to do. And other um, communities within Dane County have recently adopted new zoning codes or working on new zoning codes. For example, Sun Prairie is working on a completely new zoning code. And I think Fitchburg is going to embark on
Pittsburgh
that
is,
fairly
yeah.
soon. And so
And
that,
Middleton as well. Yeah.
yeah, Middleton finished theirs a while ago.
Yep.
There's things that you can do, like make the process more predictable, and have a predictable timeline so that you know that if you check all the boxes, it will take you this long and you'll get an approval. That's what the kind of the optimum process is. It's not having no requirements, it's having predictable requirements to know exactly what needs to be done by the developer and the architect and the engineers so that they can do that all, put it in front of the staff, and staff looks at it and says, yep, checks all the boxes, boom, you get your building permit. That's the kind of the optimum process. Modernizing outdated zoning codes. Carol mentioned if we can get away from planned development and get towards predictable conventional zoning, that helps a lot. Having zoning districts that allow a wide variety of kinds of development and scales of development so that every time you want to do something a little different in a location, you don't have to go through the rezoning process. That's important. Carol, you want to take any of these others? I know you mentioned you got legislative changes at the end. We could talk quite some time about that one.
Yeah, I could. And again, happy to get into some more detail on that if anyone has follow-up questions. But a couple of things that passed in this last legislative session that are meant to help address some of the issues include Act 173, Truth in Planning. That's a significant structural reform. So it enables automatic rezoning of land already designated for housing once certain conditions are met. And so it holds the municipality their own comprehensive planning commitments. So it also extends TIF districts by 1 year specifically to improve housing stock. That is effective January of 2028, so it's coming down the pipeline. And then WIDA had last legislative session had passed some bills that would help with downtown vitality and helping with creating housing. Unfortunately, you weren't able to stack that with other things like TIF or other programs. So Acts 237 and 239 expanded that toolkit. Act 237 now allows for loan stacking, so you can combine infrastructure access, restore Main Street, and vacancy to vitality loans with TIF and historic tax credits. So that's a pretty meaningful change. And also then Act 235 creates a voluntary, what you call pay-as-you-go workforce housing TID. Again, that's for single family homes, but it is a 20-year TID. It targets lots of 7,500 square feet and homes in the 1,500 to 2,000 square foot range. So that is that kind of missing middle product that's been hardest to finance. So that creates a pay-as-you-go workforce housing TID. And then you've got some communities. I was at a summit yesterday where they were talking about in Watertown where they were creating a revolving loan fund that would allow to help take down that cost per unit to create housing. So there's a lot of things that people are trying to do right now to make it possible to finance and build and construct the multifamily and single family housing. So those are just a couple of
All
them.
right. All right. Well, thank you all. So let's open it up. Darren, do we have any questions from anybody?
We do. We have a couple questions in the queue here, so I'll get started. Ben asks, or says, and then the question is at the end. I recently watched a meeting by the Landmarks Commission that reviewed a detached duplex ADU in a historic district. It is referred to a future meeting to be followed up on with specifics on reducing the scale because the additional building should be secondary to the primary structure. Ben says it seems like there's a concept of comparables that act as a guideline for meeting these vague criteria. And his non-expert takeaway from this is that the city could provide a catalog of examples that could help developers get a sense of what is expected for a vague design standard. Does this ring true at all from a developer's perspective?
Well, yeah, certainly if we can have some, illustrations in advance of what they're looking for, that can help a great deal. And sort of some of the smaller things that the Landmarks Commission regulates, I think they've done a lot of work um, on providing illustrations. Like, so for people who are trying to do something to update their house within a historic district, they provided a lot of illustrations. But for the kind of the larger project standards, I think it seems to be very much in the eye of the beholder about whoever is on the Landmarks Commission, and having something to provide some more predictability to developers, I think would be very helpful. Carol,
Great.
any thoughts on that?
No, I think you hit the main points there.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay, Allison asks, regarding building and safety codes, what specific regulations do you think could be dialed back?
So, on the building code side, I mentioned two. One of them is for smaller apartment buildings, and we different people are going to have different definitions of what that is, but we can look to other states and other countries to look at this, to not require two exits ways, two staircases for people in the building to be able to get out in the event of a fire. In a smaller building, you can make that work without compromising safety a great deal. It will be a little less safe. We won't try to pretend that that isn't the case, but it's kind of a balance thing. Again, our only concern is safety, we could spend infinite amounts of money trying to make everything a little safer. So at some point it's diminishing returns, and for smaller buildings requiring two exit ways, two staircases adds a lot of cost, or it removes a lot of revenue from additional units without a great deal of increase in safety. The challenge is the fire departments feel very strongly the other way. And it's hard to convince either the state regulators or the local governments to make that change when you have the fire marshal and the fire chief saying, no, 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 that you'll kill people if you do that. So that's one example. And the other one I mentioned was there used to be that the threshold for requiring all units to be sprinkled was like up to 10 units. Now it's just two. So that's why you see a lot of 2-unit buildings being built rather than like a row of 4 or 5 or 6 townhomes, because once you go beyond 2, now you've either got to sprinkle or you've got to spend a great deal of money creating barriers between each one of those units. And again, the current regulation requiring the sprinklers above 2, that does improve safety. But again, it's like at what cost? How much are we adding to each one of those units to create a little bit of additional safety? So those are the two I think I would focus on first.
And I know our team at JLA has been evaluating the new code requirements and has a list. Again, in the interest of time, won't get into all the specifics, but be happy to follow up. Darren, if you're going to be sending out information, could maybe get some follow-up on that. Because I know that there's a lot of discussion about what's good, what could be improved or taken out or modified moving forward. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. Next question. The greenfield infrastructure fees strike me as a balancing act of putting a higher price on sprawl, which comes with its own share of negative externalities. Is there a distinction to be made about greenfield that pops up far outside the current infrastructure grid versus greenfield that expands the urban boundary more incrementally?
Yeah, well, sir, first of all, we have CARPC, the Capital Area uh,
Regional
Regional
Planning Commission.
Planning Commission, which establishes a municipal sewer boundary beyond which local governments, cities cannot in this area cannot extend sewer service. So anytime you want to try to leapfrog and do development way out from the current where the current development has occurred, you have to go, the local government has to try to make a case to CARPC to allow that boundary to extend. So that's designed to prevent just sprawl from running rampant, and also to protect quality of water as well. And so you want to generally try to keep new development roughly along the edges of where development has already occurred, but you need a little flexibility there because otherwise, I talked about, you end up in a situation where if all the farmers in the area that you really think should be high priority for development choose not to sell for the next 10 years, then you've got no land for development or very little land for development, and that jacks up costs of land tremendously. So it is very much a balancing act.
Great, thank you. We're at time. The last two are just comments, so and kind of lengthy at that, but I appreciate people sharing that and just the importance of developers and the one ends with the developers not going to create a neighborhood that is environmentally unfriendly or floods. Just by design, they're willing to or wanting a good product there. With that, thank you, Bill and Carol, for being part of Madison Housing Week, sponsored by the Madison Housing Coalition. We do invite anybody to join us for the final event this evening at 3:30, which is the ADU ribbon cutting and tour at 1949 Melrose Street in Madison. And I will send out a link with the recording of this video after it'll arrive tomorrow in your inboxes. So thank you all, and thank you everyone for participating in Madison Housing Week.